Yeah, definitely. So now I know you've written a book that got published. It got published, I think, in the last spring, right?
Right.
And so, and I know you tackle a lot of these international trade and IP issues. Can you tell us a little bit about in what you and your co-author were hoping to accomplish?
Sure. My co-author Shanker Singham is an Anglo-American lawyer and economist, and in recent years he's been a senior advisor to the British government. And in this book called Competition, Trade, and Domestic Regulatory Policy, looked at trade, history of trade liberalization, which and changes in antitrust, competition law, and regulations, and said a real goal of liberalizing trade. It makes it easier for parties to trade across borders. True competition means not just tough laws, it means allowing companies to compete freely and aggressively. We talked about the pharma companies. And all of these things really require a focus on consumer welfare, which drives innovation. Unfortunately, we said there's been a growing number of restrictions created by government, which make it harder often to compete. Licensing restrictions make it harder for foreign companies to come in. Sometimes their antitrust law itself can be overly restrictive. So the idea was that you need to measure the costs of these restrictions. Now, Singham and some economist friends did a study of India that suggested it would have, if it got rid of its major restrictions, would have the fifth biggest economy in the world, and desperate poverty, 300 million people would be lifted out of desperate poverty. So what we did was talk about the key importance of intellectual property rights in creating the incentives to innovate and to expand trade. Trade itself, getting rid of trade barriers, to allow new goods and services to cross borders. There was a big liberalization, say from after World War II, some trade negotiations to the 90s, but there's been a big slowdown the last 20 years. So it's really, if we want to lift the world, not just the poor countries out of poverty, but push economic growth, we need to get rid of these restrictions. And interestingly enough, in the last 20 years, the richest countries, most developed countries, they've had a real slowdown in innovation and a slowdown in economic growth. And we argued that there's good reason to believe a lot of it has to do with restrictions of this sort. And we said that as a trade, if you start being able to measure them, you could in bilateral, multilateral agreements say, okay, if you are preventing goods or services from competing in our market, or which is a big problem, you can target the costs to our consumers and say, okay, we may not give you access, for example, to procurements in our country, but more importantly, we may target the cost to offset this. It sounds like an old-time countervailing duty, which is an old trade remedy, but the basic idea is that it will be applied, targeted to specific abuses of trade, such as if you can spot particular abuses in China, some other jurisdictions. So, and right now, we've taken this idea. There's something called a Growth Commission set up in the United Kingdom, chaired by the former UK Prime Minister Liz Truss, and it's nonpartisan, but it's pulled together some economists to study this issue, and we're doing an actually quantitative study. To what extent is per capita gross domestic product growth correlated with the strength of intellectual property protection as one, the strength of domestic competition, and the strength of international trade competition. And intellectual property, as I say, is one of them. And we're breaking that down. We're doing some of these studies. And there's a lot of recent research that shows that in the area of regulation has restricted competition. That has slowed GDP. We think we can also do some studies to show how patents, how weakening of intellectual property has slowed GDP growth, and restrictions on trade liberalization. And there'll be reports coming out later this fall, and the idea is to take this, globally. At least it's going to be released in the UK, probably a few months, a bunch of reports, but the principles are sort of universal. And, to the extent, even though it may not be perfect, to the extent you can actually show, hey, there's a real showing here that if you strengthen intellectual property, you are strengthening per capita income growth, making people better off. And if you weaken it, you're causing a slowdown, which we've seen in recent years. Yeah. That's the sort of thing that might be helpful. And to get government, say the UK government makes some findings, and again, we're looking at statistics from all kinds of countries, not just the UK, and I think it's an exciting project. And who knows, but it's one little way in which we're trying to promote the idea about the importance of competition, of protecting intellectual property, and how this is the real world. Societies are richer, and because economic growth compounds, just like inflation. So if you slow economic growth by 1% less one year and 1% the next, these numbers become huge. After a few years, you get a large percentage of gross domestic product, huge percentage smaller than it would have been absent a slowdown in growth. So I think this is exciting. Who knows what's going to come out of it? But again, as a plug, our book is called Trade, Competition, and Domestic Regulatory Policy, published in 2023 by Routledge Press, an English press.
Yeah.